Welcome to this explainer. Okay, right off the bat, I want you to picture something with me. Just imagine a single, completely still domino, standing there on a table. It's perfectly harmless, right? Completely ordinary.
But then you push it with just one finger, just a tiny, tiny amount of effort. And what happens? Bam! Within seconds, hundreds of dominoes are falling in this rapid, totally unstoppable chain reaction. Now, I want you to replace those dominoes in your mind, swap them out for people, for massive companies, or even entire nations. You see, history is rarely rewritten by one giant, dramatic decision. Actually, it usually changes because of one really small decision that kicks off a sequence literally no one can stop. And trust me, once you understand this invisible force, you're going to start seeing it absolutely everywhere. Okay, let's dive right into this with Section 1, the first falling domino.
We naturally look at massive world events, and we just assume, well, they must have had massive, earth-shattering causes. But honestly, that's an illusion. History actually pivots on the small things. Take a regular college student. Let's call him Rahul. So one Monday morning, Rahul misses his usual train by exactly 30 seconds, just half a minute. Totally frustrated, he's stuck waiting for the next one. But while he's waiting, he happens to strike up a conversation with another student on the platform. That random chat, it turns into a friendship. And years later, that very same friend becomes his business partner. Literally, one missed train by a fraction of a minute completely altered the course of his entire life. It sounds kind of unbelievable, right? But that is exactly how chain reactions work in the real world.
Which brings us to a really important distinction in Section 2. Domino versus butterfly effect.
So the first event in these chains almost always looks totally insignificant at the time. And because the consequences aren't immediately obvious, people constantly mix up two very different concepts. You've probably heard of the butterfly effect, right? That suggests that a tiny change early on can eventually produce a vastly different outcome in a random complex system. But the domino effect, it's not random chaos. It is strictly, entirely sequential. One event actively pushes another, which pushes the next. It's a direct, inescapable line of impact.
So, how do we use this? Let's move to Section 3, thinking 2 steps ahead.
How do the most successful minds out there actually navigate this sequence? Well, our brains naturally just want to focus on that first decision. You know, it's easy, it takes way less energy, and the result is immediate. But experienced leaders use what psychologists call second-order thinking. This is a massive psychological shift. It's moving from merely asking, okay, what happens if I do this, to actively evaluating the second, the third, and even the 10th consequence of that single decision. Instead of stopping at that initial choice, great leaders repeatedly ask this exact question. What happens after that? And once they get an answer, they literally ask it again. Right, okay, but what happens after that? It sounds incredibly simple, doesn't it? But this one tiny shift in mindset changes absolutely everything about how you navigate both risk and opportunity.
Let's see how this builds in Section 4, chain reactions in systems.
Let's zoom out for a second to the macro scale of business and politics. Just imagine a major smartphone company discovers a tiny, barely noticeable manufacturing defect affecting just a handful of devices. To save a little money today, they decide, let's just ignore it. Well, almost immediately, customers start posting videos of this defect online. Public trust absolutely plummets, and this triggers a massive panic, right? Sales decline, investors get spooked and pull out, employees lose confidence. Within just a few months, competitors effortlessly swoop in and steal their market share. So one small decision to save a little cash creates a devastating, totally unstoppable cascade.
And you see this exact same chain reaction dictating global politics too. When governments face massive public calls for, say, a resignation or a major policy change, the decision extends way beyond just one individual or one isolated event. Political analysts step back and immediately ask, does giving in today create a precedent? Is this going to encourage similar demands tomorrow? Decision makers absolutely have to consider not just the immediate outcome of their choice, but the entire chain of expectations they're setting up for future decisions.
Actually, history repeats this pattern on a massive scale. The historical record is super clear on this. Back in 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was a severe tragedy, obviously. But that singular event didn't just magically create a world war all by itself. It was the trigger. It set off this totally unavoidable chain reaction of alliances being called in, declarations of war, and military actions. History, quite literally, moves exactly like falling dominoes.
All right, let's bring this home with Section 5, your next invisible decision.
So the crucial point here is that this isn't just about massive world events or billion-dollar corporate blunders. It quietly shapes your everyday habits too.
Think about it. You skip one workout, and honestly, nothing changes. But you skip another, and then another, and a few months later, you're noticeably less healthy. But hey, the reverse is just as powerful. Say you read 10 pages of a book every day. It feels completely insignificant in the moment, right? But skip ahead 1 year, and you've finished several entire books. One tiny habit builds an entirely different future.
Which brings us to a question I want you to really sit with for a second. Why do experienced leaders often appear so slow? I mean, people constantly look at politicians or CEOs and think, why don't they just make the obvious decision, like it is right in front of them?
Well, the answer lies in their perspective. They aren't evaluating the first domino. They're looking at the 100th. When experienced leaders pause and take their time, it's because they're calculating the future expectations born from today's actions. And let me tell you, it's an incredibly difficult calculation to make, often with no clear or immediate answer.
Now, what's absolutely crucial to realize here is that every single decision carries two sets of consequences, the visible ones and the invisible ones. The visible consequence is right there on the surface. It's easy for anyone to see. But the invisible chain reaction, that underlying machinery of cause and effect, that is where the real story actually begins. Whether it's in politics, in business, or just in your own personal life.
So here's what I want to leave you with. Tonight, or whenever you're about to make your next important decision, just pause. Don't only ask what happens next, push yourself. Ask what happens after that. And then ask it again. Because history, massive companies, governments, and our own ordinary lives are rarely shaped by one huge dramatic moment. They're shaped by thousands of tiny small decisions, each one quietly pushing the next domino. And honestly, the most powerful decision you will ever make is probably going to look completely ordinary right up until the day you realize it changed absolutely everything.